January 21st, 1944. The Pacific sky is a blistering blue, a color so deep it almost feels surreal. Below, the ocean churns, a vast expanse dotted with the dark silhouettes of Japanese warships. Among them, the Musashi, Japan's largest battleship, is anchored in the heart of the fleet. Its guns, capable of launching hellfire, lie dormant, waiting for the approaching American forces. On board a P-38 Lightning, Lieutenant Dick Bong, eyes narrowed and heart pounding, banks sharply toward the enemy. At just 50 feet above the water, his aircraft seems to skim the waves, nearly kissing the ocean's surface as it roars toward the fleet. The Japanese don't see him yet. There's a split second of silence, the calm before a storm. The wind howls as Bong grips the controls with determination, knowing the risks. At this altitude, one wrong move, one stray bullet, and it's over. But this is no ordinary assault. As he locks onto the Musashi, his hands tremble for just a fraction of a second. He's about to dive headfirst into the maw of one of the most heavily defended fleets in the world. The noise of the P-38's engines grows louder, deafening, as Bong tightens his grip on the throttle. The moment has arrived. With a flash of metal, the first bomb drops. The year is 1944, and the war in the Pacific is nearing its decisive phase. The Allied forces have been pushing westward across the Pacific Ocean, reclaiming island after island from the Japanese Empire. After the hard-fought Battle of the Philippine Sea and the devastating blow dealt at Midway, the Japanese Navy's ability to maintain control of the Pacific has been steadily diminishing. But Japan is far from defeated. They still hold formidable naval power and the will to defend their homeland at all costs. By October, the Allies have landed on Leyte Island in the Philippines. It is the beginning of General Douglas MacArthur's promise to return to the Philippines, which had been under Japanese occupation since 1942. The Japanese Imperial Navy, recognizing the strategic importance of the Philippines, launches a massive counterattack to halt the American invasion. The Battle of Leyte Gulf would become the largest naval battle in history. Spanning from October 23rd to October 26th, it involved a combined force of over 200 ships, 1,500 aircraft, and thousands of men on both sides. The Japanese, though outnumbered, had a plan. They would attempt to break the American supply line and cripple their landing forces with a coordinated three-pronged attack. The result would be either a desperate Japanese victory or the death knell for their navy. For the Americans, the operation had been meticulously planned, but it was clear that a devastating confrontation was coming. Every day, American pilots and sailors prepared themselves for the inevitable clash with the Japanese fleet. As the battle loomed closer, air units like those of the 7th Fleet began to prepare for their most dangerous missions yet, an all-out effort to disrupt and destroy the Japanese battle groups. But even in this crucial moment, few could predict what would happen next. The Japanese Navy, in its final attempts to protect the Philippines, had assembled its last great armada. Among the most feared of its ships were the Yamato and Musashi, two of the largest battleships ever built. Armed with 18.1-inch guns capable of firing shells that could crush an entire city block, these ships were the backbone of the Imperial Navy. The Japanese also had a range of smaller vessels, including destroyers, light cruisers, and aircraft carriers. But more importantly, the Japanese Navy still had a potent air force, fighter pilots and bombers who had learned to carry out death-defying attacks with ruthless precision. The American side, however, had a clear advantage. Not only were they supported by an overwhelming number of ships and aircraft, but their ability to wage coordinated attacks from the air had already proven to be decisive. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the 3rd Fleet, and Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, leading the 7th Fleet, had one primary goal: destroy the Japanese fleet and secure the Philippines. And the airmen, the aviators flying planes like the P-38 Lightning, TBF Avenger, and F-6F Hellcat, would be crucial in carrying out this mission. The P-38 Lightning, a twin-engine fighter, was an unusual but effective tool in this battle. It was fast, heavily armed, and had the ability to dive from high altitudes, striking at the heart of enemy formations with devastating precision. Pilots like Dick Bong, already a seasoned airman with a reputation for aggressiveness, knew the risks and the rewards that came with such a dangerous maneuver. On the morning of October 24, 1944, the Japanese launched their first strike, a desperate attempt to defend their fleet. But the Americans, with their superior radar technology and aircraft, intercepted the Japanese planes before they could do any significant damage. Yet, the Japanese were not about to give up. They would retaliate in full force, drawing the Americans into a deadly dance of aerial dogfights and bombings that would test the limits of both sides. As the hours ticked down, both the American and Japanese forces braced for what would be a brutal, high-stakes contest. By October 25, 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf was fully engaged. The sky was thick with smoke, the sea churned with the violent clash of ships, and the air was heavy with the sound of constant bombings and gunfire. The Japanese, despite their numerical disadvantage, had not yet given up hope of victory. Their remaining aircraft, piloted by men willing to sacrifice everything for their emperor, swarmed over the American lines like hornets, looking for any weakness to exploit. The Japanese fleet, battered but not broken, was now split into smaller groups, each with different objectives. The center force, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, made its move through the San Bernardino Strait. His force, including the massive battleships Yamato and Musashi, was attempting to break through the American defensive lines and strike directly at the heart of the American invasion force in Leyte Gulf. It was a desperate last-ditch effort, but the scale of the gamble was enormous. To counter this, the Americans had set up a multi-layered defense, using their superior radar and aircraft to identify enemy movements before they became a threat. Admiral Halsey, commanding the Third Fleet, deployed his carriers and bombers to search for the Japanese fleet. His aircraft would conduct strikes from above while his warships would maneuver to intercept any retreating ships. Admiral Kinkaid, in command of the Seventh Fleet, focused on protecting the Leyte beachhead and ensuring the success of the ground invasion. At the same time, Lieutenant Dick Bong and his fellow pilots prepared for one of the most dangerous missions of their careers. Their task was to intercept and neutralize any aircraft that might threaten the fleet. In his P-38 Lightning, Bong was no stranger to intense combat. He had already proven himself as an ace, with several kills to his name. Yet nothing could prepare him for the audacity of the mission ahead, attacking the Musashi, one of the largest battleships in the world, from just 50 feet above the ocean's surface. As Bong's squadron took off from the aircraft carrier USS Monterey, the tension was palpable. The air was thick with the noise of engines and the scent of aviation fuel. Every pilot knew the risks of a low-level attack. At such a height, they would be vulnerable to enemy fire from the ships and any incoming Japanese aircraft. But Bong had a plan, a daring, high-risk maneuver that he believed could turn the tide of battle in their favor. The weather was in his favor. Clear skies and calm seas stretched out ahead. Yet the Japanese fleet loomed in the distance, their enormous warships ready to retaliate against any threat. The clock was ticking, and time was running out. The stakes of this battle could not be overstated. If the Japanese managed to halt the American advance in Leyte Gulf, they would not only have secured the Philippines but also prolonged the war in the Pacific by years. For the Americans, victory was within reach, but so was danger. Bong and his fellow pilots would soon be plunged into a hellish maelstrom of anti-aircraft fire, high-speed dogfights, and a constant battle to stay alive. Their courage would define the outcome of this battle. But nothing would prepare them for the astonishing, almost impossible act of bravery that was about to unfold. For Lieutenant Dick Bong, the stakes could not have been higher. At just 24 years old, he had already earned the title of America's top ace, with over 30 confirmed kills. Yet, the dangers of war had never felt so immediate. The possibility of death was ever present, and on this particular mission, it felt almost inevitable. There was no margin for error. At only 50 feet above the water, the P-38 Lightning was flying dangerously close to the surface of the Pacific, just above the cresting waves. Even the slightest miscalculation, whether from the aircraft itself, a ricochet from enemy fire, or a sharp turn, could send him plunging into the sea, his aircraft shattered beyond recognition. But Bong was no stranger to this kind of pressure. He had already faced death countless times during previous engagements, yet his resolve had only grown stronger. It wasn't just his life on the line, it was the success of the mission, the lives of the men around him, and the future of the war. He had learned to embrace the chaos of combat, to quiet the fear that could otherwise paralyze him, and to focus solely on the task at hand. His mind raced, but it was focused, calculating. He knew his target, the Musashi, the pride of the Japanese Imperial Navy. He knew that if he could land a blow, it could shift the course of the battle, perhaps even the war itself. As he descended lower and lower, it wasn't just the technical aspects of piloting that held his attention. It was the sense of inevitability, the moment when one becomes acutely aware that survival isn't guaranteed. He could feel his heartbeat quicken as he approached the target. He pushed everything else from his mind, locking onto the Musashi with a clear, singular focus. His instincts had been honed for moments like this. The mental clarity of the trained soldier had taken over, the moment when fear was not absent, but irrelevant. His entire existence narrowed to the split-second decision of whether to press the attack or pull away. He chose the former, diving straight into the jaws of hell. The human cost of this attack was more than just the potential loss of life. It was the toll it took on the soul, the emotional weight carried by every combatant. For Bong, there was a deep, quiet understanding that his decisions would either save or cost lives. Yet, in those final moments, there was no time to dwell on the what-ifs. There was only the mission. In military strategy, there are risks that may seem unthinkable, yet, when executed correctly, they can bring about game-changing results. The idea of flying at such a low altitude, just above the ocean's surface, was considered a suicide run by many. The risk of anti-aircraft fire was extreme. Even small bursts from the flak guns on the Musashi or its supporting ships could destroy an aircraft instantly. And yet, this is exactly what Bong was prepared to do. The maneuver was rooted in surprise and precision. By flying so low, the pilots minimized the effectiveness of enemy radar and made it difficult for defenders to accurately aim their anti-aircraft guns. The tactic required lightning-fast reflexes. The closer you were to the target, the more likely you were to avoid flak, but the closer you were to the water, the more perilous the maneuver. Every degree of tilt, every change in pressure on the controls, had to be calculated to avoid crashing into the ocean. The low-altitude tactic required not only precision flying but the audacity to confront danger head-on. What made Bong's approach so extraordinary was his unwavering commitment to this strategy. While many pilots preferred higher, safer altitudes to avoid enemy fire, Bong took the opposite route. He was willing to fly dangerously close to the Japanese fleet in the hopes of gaining a devastating advantage, one swift attack that could alter the balance of power in the Pacific. In some ways, this maneuver symbolized the broader strategic context of the war. The Allies, having gained air superiority, were using their newfound technological edge to push the Japanese back. Every battle, every mission was about gaining an advantage. Yet, despite overwhelming air superiority, the risks were still immense. For every successful dive, there were countless others that ended in failure or death. The suicide run was the embodiment of the high-stakes warfare that defined the Pacific theater. The P-38 Lightning was a marvel of aviation engineering, an aircraft that, at the time, was like no other. With its twin-boom fuselage and distinctive nose-mounted engine, it was a combination of brute force and precision. It was built for long-range combat and was capable of high-speed interceptions and precision bombing runs. In a war where technological supremacy often meant the difference between life and death, the P-38 was one of the United States' most effective tools. Bong's P-38, equipped with powerful .50 caliber machine guns and armed with bombs, was a deadly weapon when put into the right hands. Could reach speeds of up to 400 miles per hour, making it one of the fastest fighters in the skies. More importantly, it had an unprecedented combination of firepower and maneuverability. This allowed pilots like Bong to dive from great altitudes and engage targets with surgical precision. For Bong, the P-38 was more than just an aircraft. It was an extension of his will, a tool for carrying out his mission with relentless accuracy. Its design allowed it to perform at high speeds in extreme conditions, and its weaponry could deliver devastating blows to enemy targets. The aircraft's stability at low altitudes made it ideal for the low-level suicide runs that were becoming a hallmark of the Pacific Campaign. Even when facing intense enemy fire, The P-38 remained stable and could continue its run as long as the pilot maintained control. However, the technology of the time, despite its many advantages, still had limitations. There were no advanced targeting systems like those used in modern warfare, meaning the pilots had to rely on visual targeting, a skill honed only through countless hours of practice and experience. The radar capabilities were also limited, so Bong's ability to stay undetected by the Japanese fleet's radar was a matter of luck and skill rather than technological superiority. In the context of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the P-38 was one of the few aircraft capable of carrying out such a high-risk, high-reward tactic. It was the combination of its technology, the tactical brilliance of its pilots, and the mission at hand that would define the success or failure of this strike. Bong's low-altitude run, in particular, would become a defining moment, showcasing both the potential of aviation technology and the extraordinary courage required to wield it in combat. At the heart of the American operation in the Pacific stood Admiral William Halsey, a man whose reputation for boldness and aggression made him one of the most respected and feared naval commanders in U.S. history. As the commander of the Third Fleet, Halsey had orchestrated a series of daring and decisive moves that had turned the tide of the war in the Pacific. But the Battle of Leyte Gulf was different. It was a critical moment, one that would require not just brute force, but a mastery of tactical brilliance and nerve. Halsey's decision to send the Third Fleet into battle, leaving the Leyte invasion vulnerable to the Japanese forces, was a high-risk gamble. He believed that, by drawing the Japanese fleet into a decisive battle, he could wipe out their remaining naval power and secure American control of the Philippines. It was a bold move, but one that carried immense risks. If the Japanese had succeeded in their counterattack, the results would have been catastrophic. Halsey, known for his aggressive tactics, was willing to put everything on the line for a chance at victory. The strategy was simple: take the fight to the Japanese fleet, destroy their carriers, and cripple their remaining surface vessels. But Halsey's decision to chase after what appeared to be a decoy force of Japanese aircraft carriers left the American landing forces exposed to the full force of the Japanese center force, led by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. It was this force that would come into direct conflict with Bong's P-38 squadron. Halsey's leadership, while effective in some ways, was also a reflection of the larger strategy of the Allies in the Pacific. The war was one of attrition, where battles were won not just through military might, but through the ability to take bold risks and manage overwhelming odds. Halsey's pursuit of the Japanese fleet was a perfect example of the stakes involved in the conflict, where even the smallest misstep could lead to disaster. It was a risk that paid off for the Americans, but it could have just as easily gone the other way. On the other side of the battle stood the determined and desperate Japanese Imperial Navy. By late 1944, Japan's naval power had been severely weakened, its resources stretched thin. The loss of key aircraft carriers, battleships, and experienced pilots had made the Japanese Navy's survival in the Pacific increasingly unlikely. Still, the Japanese had not given up. Their response to the American advances was swift, and their forces were willing to make extreme sacrifices to protect the homeland. The Musashi, flagship of the Japanese center force, was a symbol of Japan's military might. An imposing battleship with 18.1-inch guns, capable of firing shells that could devastate entire fleets. Yet, despite its formidable size and firepower, it was not invincible. The ship, like the rest of the Japanese Navy, had become a target for American air power, and its crew knew the dangers that lay ahead. But what they didn't know was that the Americans were coming in with new, unconventional tactics, like the low-altitude assault that Bong was about to carry out. For the Japanese defenders, the situation was bleak. Their radar systems were limited, and their anti-aircraft capabilities, though deadly, were no match for the speed and surprise of Bong's attack. The Japanese Navy, stretched thin and outnumbered, was caught off guard by the aggressive and unexpected American strike. As Bong's bombs hit the Musashi, the Japanese response was frantic, but it came too late. In those final moments, the Japanese Navy would be forced to reckon with a new, more lethal aspect of American air superiority: the willingness of their pilots to take on extreme risks to bring the fight to their doorstep. It was a scene that seemed pulled from the pages of history, a reckless yet brilliant act of courage. Lieutenant Dick Bong, locked in his P-38 Lightning, could barely see the horizon ahead. The saltwater spray from the ocean whipped against the cockpit as he flew just inches above the waves. The sky above him was clear, perfect for the mission, but the air was charged with anticipation. He knew what was ahead. A lone P-38 in the heart of the Japanese fleet, 50 feet from destruction. For the next few minutes, Bong's focus narrowed entirely to the target before him, the Musashi, one of the largest and most powerful battleships ever built. The massive ship's guns, capable of wreaking havoc on entire fleets, lay dormant, unaware of the approaching threat. Bong's plane was barely a speck in the vast sky, but he knew that at this moment, it would be more than enough to change the course of the battle. The roar of his engines was deafening, and the vibration of the aircraft's structure under the pressure of the low-level flight was almost unbearable. Bong pushed the throttle harder, urging his plane to dive even lower, flying beneath the thick wall of anti-aircraft fire that erupted from the Japanese ships below. The Musashi's defenses were formidable. Flak guns fired in rapid bursts, tracer rounds lighting up the sky like streaks of fire. But the closer he got, the more the Japanese defenses struggled to track him. His nerves were steady, his breath calm. Despite the chaos of war around him, Bong was laser-focused. His target was in sight, and his timing was critical. As he closed in on the Musashi, the whole world seemed to pause. It was as if time itself held its breath for the brief moment before impact. With the first strike, the explosion was deafening. The bomb tore through the ship's deck, sending shockwaves across the surrounding ships. The impact was so intense that it seemed as if the entire fleet had been rocked by the force of Bong's attack. But he couldn't stop. The mission wasn't complete yet. The Musashi, still towering over the ocean, would not go down with just one hit. Bong had to make another pass. The next few minutes were a blur of adrenaline and instinct. Bong executed a daring second pass, a calculated risk that seemed suicidal by any measure. The air around him was filled with enemy fire, but his P-38 moved with the agility and speed that only a trained aviator could command. The next bomb dropped, and once again, the ship erupted into flames. The Musashi, struck twice in a matter of seconds, began to list heavily. The explosion didn't just destroy the ship's hull, it shattered the morale of the remaining Japanese forces. The Musashi, once a symbol of naval might, was now a flaming wreck, sinking slowly into the Pacific waters. The sound of the ship's massive guns falling silent reverberated through the entire fleet. This was the turning point. In those few minutes, Bong had executed a flawless, daring maneuver that defied the odds. His suicide run had not only crippled one of the most powerful ships in the Japanese fleet, but had also sent a shockwave through the enemy's defenses. For the Japanese, it was a devastating blow to their confidence and their naval capabilities. It was a moment of triumph, but also a moment of deep reflection. The American forces had lost many pilots, many soldiers, and many ships to reach this point. Yet, the attack on the Musashi marked a moment where the tide turned irreversibly in favor of the Allies. The Japanese would never recover from the blow dealt that day. Bong's name would soon be etched into history, but in those moments, as he pulled away from the Musashi's wreckage, he knew that this was just one victory in a much larger struggle. As Bong pulled his P-38 away from the wreckage of the Musashi, the immediate aftermath of the attack sent shockwaves through the entire battle. The giant battleship, once the pride of the Japanese Imperial Navy, was now in flames, listing heavily to one side, its guns silenced. The impact of Bong's two strikes had caused massive damage, not only to the ship itself but to the morale of the entire Japanese fleet. Bong's bold low-altitude bombing run, what many had dismissed as a suicidal tactic, had proven devastatingly effective. The Musashi was not the only ship in the immediate vicinity to suffer. The explosion had ignited fires on several nearby vessels, and the flak barrage that once filled the sky began to dissipate as Japanese gunners were forced to focus on their own survival rather than countering incoming American aircraft. The attack had created a moment of confusion among the defenders, and it was during this crucial time that American bombers, like those on Admiral Halsey's carriers, dove in for their own strikes. As the Japanese forces scrambled to respond, the Third Fleet was able to press its advantage. With the Musashi crippled and sinking, the center force had been dealt a decisive blow. The Japanese fleet's ability to mount an effective defense against the American advance was effectively shattered. For the Japanese, the loss of their flagship was symbolic, the heart of their remaining naval strength pierced, causing panic and disarray. The second bomb dropped onto the Musashi had ignited a firestorm that would consume the ship over the next few hours. The flames reached skyward, a towering inferno that could be seen for miles. Vice Admiral Kurita, commanding the center force, knew the battle was lost. The Musashi was not only a major asset but a symbol of Japan's defiance. Now, as it burned and slowly sank beneath the waves, so too did the resolve of the Japanese fleet. Meanwhile, Bong's squadron, having completed its strike, was already making its way back to base. The sheer audacity of their mission had left them shaken, but there was no time for hesitation. They were part of a larger force, part of a greater strategy, and their victory, while significant, was just one chapter in the larger campaign. However, the damage Bong's strike had inflicted on the Musashi and the surrounding fleet would have repercussions far beyond this one battle. On the American side, the strike was hailed as a masterstroke, a display of tactical brilliance that demonstrated the importance of daring maneuvers in modern warfare. It was a victory for the bold, for those like Bong who were willing to face the odds head-on. But even as they celebrated, the war was far from over. The Japanese Navy would not surrender so easily. But the attack on the Musashi had dealt a blow so significant that the strategic advantage now lay firmly in the hands of the Allies. In the broader context of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Bong's strike was one of several turning points. The Japanese Navy's losses would soon become irreplaceable, and by the time the final shots were fired on October 26, the Allies had gained complete control of the Philippines. The result of this victory was not just a tactical shift. It was a decisive moment that would set the course for the final phase of the Pacific War. With the Japanese Navy crippled, the Allies now had the upper hand in their march toward Japan's home islands. Bong's act of bravery and genius in those few minutes had shifted the momentum in the war. The Musashi, now a smoldering wreck on the seabed, would forever symbolize the beginning of the end for Japan's naval power. For Bong and the rest of the American pilots, this was not just another successful mission. It was the culmination of years of hard-fought battles, a dramatic illustration of how a single attack could alter the course of history. The Musashi was gone, and with it, a massive portion of Japan's naval power. The loss of the battleship was not just a physical blow to the Imperial Navy. It was a symbolic one. As the Musashi sank beneath the waves of the Philippine Sea, it marked the end of an era for the Japanese Navy. The ship, once a symbol of Japan's might and technological achievement, had been brought down by a single low-altitude strike, a remarkable feat of daring and precision. The attack had shattered the illusion of invulnerability that the Japanese had long held over their fleet. The Japanese response was immediate, but it was too late. Despite the Musashi's destruction, the battle raged on for several more days, but the damage was already done. The center force, the most formidable remaining arm of the Japanese Navy, was effectively neutralized. With the loss of the Musashi and the damage inflicted on other vessels, the Japanese fleet no longer had the power to contest the Allied advance in the Philippines. The Japanese Navy, once a force capable of shaping the course of the Pacific War, was now broken. As the battle continued, other American forces, including aircraft from the 3rd Fleet and ships from Admiral Kinkaid's 7th Fleet, relentlessly pressed the attack. The Japanese were forced into a series of disorganized retreats, and by the end of October 26, the Battle of Leyte Gulf had concluded in a decisive Allied victory. The Japanese had lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, and several cruisers and destroyers, while the Americans had only lost a few smaller vessels and suffered comparatively fewer casualties. The psychological impact on the Japanese Navy was devastating. The loss of the Musashi, one of the largest battleships ever built, was felt deeply. Not only did it deplete Japan's fighting strength, but it also shattered the morale of the remaining sailors. In the span of just a few days, the Japanese Navy had gone from being a formidable force to one struggling to regroup and defend its homeland. The tide of war in the Pacific had decisively turned in favor of the Allies. For the Allied forces, the victory at Leyte was a major milestone. It was the beginning of the end for Japanese naval power and a critical step in securing the Philippines, which would serve as a key launch point for the final assault on the Japanese home islands. The battle itself had been a bloody one, with thousands of lives lost on both sides, but the strategic importance of the victory could not be overstated. The Japanese would no longer be able to contest the Allies' dominance of the Pacific. The larger impact on the Pacific War. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had been a watershed moment in the Pacific theater. Not only had it crippled Japan's naval power, but it also sealed the fate of the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur, having fulfilled his promise to return to the Philippines, now had a clear path to continue his island-hopping campaign towards Japan. With the Japanese fleet in disarray, the Allies could now focus on the final phase of the war, the invasion of Japan's home islands. The loss of the Musashi, along with the other battleships and carriers destroyed at Leyte, marked the final collapse of Japan's ability to conduct major offensive operations at sea. The battle also demonstrated the full force of American air superiority, a superiority that had been honed through years of brutal combat, technological innovation, and relentless training. The P-38 Lightning, the aircraft that Dick Bong had flown, would forever be associated with that victory. Yet, despite the overwhelming success at Leyte, the war was far from over. Japan would continue to fight fiercely in the months ahead, as evidenced by their last-ditch defense efforts during the Battle of Okinawa. The kamikaze tactics that would come to symbolize Japan's desperation in the final stages of the war would soon be unleashed, and the Allies would face further hardships before victory could be achieved. But from the wreckage of the Musashi, a new reality had emerged. Japan's ability to project naval power had been broken, and the Americans now held the initiative. For Lieutenant Dick Bong, the consequences of his actions were immediate but also profound. He had earned the Medal of Honor for his bravery and tactical brilliance. His role in the destruction of the Musashi would be remembered as one of the most daring moments of the Pacific War, a moment that exemplified the courage and ingenuity of the men who fought it. Yet Bong, ever humble, would go on to fight in subsequent campaigns, continuing to demonstrate his skill and resolve until he was tragically killed in a training accident just a few months later. His legacy, however, would live on. The victory at Leyte Gulf marked the moment when the Japanese Navy's ability to challenge American forces was irrevocably broken, and Bong's audacious attack on the Musashi became a defining moment of that larger shift. The American victory at Leyte Gulf was not only a triumph of military tactics but also a crucial turning point that altered the strategic landscape of the entire Pacific theater. While the destruction of the Musashi and the defeat of the Japanese fleet had dealt a devastating blow to Japan's naval capabilities, the psychological impact was just as significant. For the Japanese military, the loss of so many ships and pilots in a single battle was a crippling blow, one that exposed the true extent of their vulnerability. It was clear that their ability to defend their homeland had been severely compromised. In the immediate aftermath, Japanese propaganda efforts struggled to explain the scale of the loss. The Musashi was not just a battleship. It was a symbol of Japan's military pride. To lose it in such a dramatic fashion, to have it sunk by a combination of American air superiority and sheer tactical audacity, shattered the myth of invincibility that had surrounded the Imperial Navy. The psychological toll on the remaining Japanese forces was immense. With each passing day, it became more apparent that the war was slipping out of their control. For the Allied forces, the victory at Leyte was an affirmation of their strategic and technological advantages. The effectiveness of American air and naval power was now undeniable. The P-38 Lightning and other American aircraft had proven their worth in combat, and the United States Navy was now firmly in control of the Pacific waters. The destruction of the Musashi, in particular, highlighted the incredible precision and bravery of the American pilots who had carried out such a daring strike. For Lieutenant Dick Bong and his fellow airmen, the battle was a defining moment that solidified their place in history. However, the aftermath of the battle was not without its own costs. Despite the crushing blow to Japan's naval power, the battle had been costly for the Allies as well. Over 5,000 Japanese sailors and airmen were killed, and the loss of so many ships and aircraft meant that the Japanese were still able to offer some resistance. As the war moved into its final stages, The kamikaze attacks and other forms of desperate resistance became a hallmark of the Japanese defense, particularly in the Battle of Okinawa. For the Americans, the victory at Leyte represented just one step in a much larger and more brutal campaign to defeat Japan. The broader strategic impact, the path to Japan's surrender. The results of Leyte Gulf were far-reaching. The immediate destruction of the Japanese fleet, combined with the Allied capture of the Philippines, set the stage for the final phase of the Pacific War. With the Japanese unable to effectively contest the Allies' control of the Philippines, American forces were able to establish key airbases and staging points for the upcoming assaults on the Japanese home islands. The victory at Leyte marked the beginning of the final push towards Japan's eventual surrender. At the same time, the battle underscored the increasingly desperate nature of Japan's defense. With their naval power decimated, the Japanese turned to their kamikaze tactics, using suicide missions as a last-ditch effort to slow the American advance. These tactics, born of necessity rather than strategy, would be employed in full force during the Battle of Okinawa and would continue to be a source of terror for American forces in the final months of the war. Despite the psychological and tactical blows dealt at Leyte, Japan's leaders were still unwilling to surrender. It would take nearly another year of grueling combat, culminating in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, before Japan would officially capitulate. But the Battle of Leyte Gulf was the death knell for Japan's naval ambitions. It marked the end of their ability to control the seas and brought the Allied forces one step closer to victory. For the men who fought in the battle, the memory of the Musashi's destruction and the attacks on the Japanese fleet would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The daring maneuvers, the bravery under fire, and the overwhelming sense of purpose would be ingrained in their minds. The victory had been hard-won, but it had opened the door to the final chapter of the Pacific War. The subsequent Allied victories in the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa would all serve as stepping stones toward Japan's surrender in 1945. For Lieutenant Dick Bong, the victory at Leyte was bittersweet. He had become a symbol of American air superiority, a hero for his actions. But the personal cost of war weighed heavily on him. Just months after the Battle of Leyte Gulf, while training for new missions, Bong tragically lost his life in a plane crash. He had completed more than 200 combat missions and had been credited with 40 aerial victories, making him the highest-scoring American air ace in the Pacific. His death, though not related to combat, underscored the relentless nature of war. A war that claimed not only soldiers in battle but also those who survived and returned home. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, and particularly the attack on the Musashi, is a moment in history that continues to resonate with us today. In a world dominated by technology and vast military machines, it was the courage of individual men, pilots like Lieutenant Dick Bong, that proved decisive. His daring suicide run, executed at an impossible altitude with unflinching resolve, became one of the most symbolic and powerful examples of the human cost of war. It was a gamble that could have easily ended in disaster but instead tilted the scales in favor of the Allies, altering the course of the Pacific War. In many ways, Bong's actions embody the essence of WW2 air combat, a deadly blend of raw courage, technical mastery, and an unyielding sense of duty. While the technology of aircraft like the P-38 Lightning played a critical role in shifting the balance of power in the Pacific, it was the pilots who harnessed these machines and made the split-second decisions that determined victory or defeat. Bong's personal sacrifice in the face of overwhelming odds reflected a broader theme of the war: the relentless pursuit of victory, no matter the cost. Yet, the true cost of this victory, and others like it, was not just measured in the number of ships sunk or battles won, but in the lives of those who fought. The loss of the Musashi was a profound moment for the Japanese, a sign that their naval supremacy was no longer a given. But for the American pilots, sailors, and soldiers, it was a bittersweet triumph. They knew that this victory had brought them closer to ending the war, but the toll of the campaign had been heavy on both sides. It was a war fought not just for territory, but for the survival of ideals, for freedom, and for the future of a generation. The legacy of the Battle of Leyte Gulf is one of bravery and sacrifice. The destruction of the Musashi marked the collapse of the Japanese Navy's ability to contest the Pacific. It set the stage for the final stages of the war and the eventual surrender of Japan in 1945. For Lieutenant Bong, it sealed his place in history, forever remembered as one of the greatest aerial aces of the war. His daring attack on the Musashi was not just a victory for him, but a victory for all those who fought alongside him and for the future generations who would inherit the peace won by their sacrifice. In the end, the Battle of Leyte Gulf is a reminder of the extraordinary courage that defined WW2. A courage that was not reserved for generals or admirals, but for the young men like Dick Bong who took to the skies knowing full well the risks involved and gave everything they had for a chance to make history.